Okay, so let's dive into a story that really reshaped early America. It's a conflict that's often overshadowed by more famous battles, but honestly, its consequences defined the future of New England and the relationship between settlers and native peoples for centuries. This is the unseen story of King Philip's War. Right, we all have this image in our heads, don't we? The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people sharing that first Thanksgiving meal. But that one moment of peace? That's really just the prologue. Today, we're going to peel back the layers on a conflict that goes way beyond what most of us ever learned in school. We're going to ask, how on earth did that fragile peace just shatter into one of the deadliest wars in American history? For about 50 years after the Pilgrims landed, things were, relatively peaceful. A huge reason for that was Massasoit, the great sachem or chief of the Wampanoag. He was a really shrewd leader who saw the English as potential allies against rival tribes. So he befriended them, he forged an alliance, and that didn't just help the Plymouth colony survive, it actually strengthened his own position in the region. But you have to understand, this peace was incredibly fragile. And to really get a handle on just how fragile, we need to look at another conflict that happened earlier. It served as this dark, bloody warning of what could happen. It was a terrifying glimpse into a different and much, much more brutal possibility. The Pequot War. This set a terrifying precedent. It wasn't just a military victory for the colonists. It was basically an extermination. The Puritans' own accounts admit they intended to cause the maximum number of casualties. And crucially, it established this brutal practice, enslaving captives, who were then sold off to colonies as far away as the Caribbean. So this wasn't just a battle, it was also a business model. So, by the time Massasoit's son, Metacom, who the English called King Philip, came to power, the world his father had navigated was just disappearing. That fragile peace was cracking under the weight of decades of pressure, and a storm was about to break. The tension wasn't about any one single thing. It was this constant series of cultural and economic clashes. I mean, just imagine you're a Wampanoag, right? English settlers move into villages that were left empty by disease. Their cattle and pigs are wandering into your fields and eating your crops, and then their courts start punishing you for stuff like firing a gun on a Sunday. Every single aspect of your life is becoming a point of friction. And you can really hear that constant atmosphere of distrust in Metacom's own words. He's basically saying that the threat of war wasn't new. It had been a constant rumor, a constant worry, for 4 decades. These jealousies of war had become a normal part of life, which just goes to show you how strained things were long before the first shot was ever fired. So the final trigger, the thing that finally lit the fuse, was an act of colonial justice. When the English executed 3 of Metacom's men for killing an informant, the Wampanoag didn't just see it as a punishment. For them, it was a profound violation of their sovereignty. It was like a declaration that their right to govern themselves was over. And from now on, English law was the only law. And that spark, it ignited a firestorm that would engulf all of New England. What started in one small corner of Plymouth colony quickly spiraled into this massive, devastating war that left absolutely no one untouched. Now, this was not a war of orderly battles with soldiers lining up. It was a brutal guerrilla conflict. Native warriors, who were masters of the terrain, staged these shocking ambushes like the one at Bloody Brook. The colonists retaliated with just overwhelming force, like they did in the Great Swamp Fight. They stormed the neutral Narragansett tribe in the middle of winter, burning their homes and slaughtering hundreds of men, women, and children. It was a terrifying cycle of violence that just consumed the entire region for over a year. When the fighting finally ended, it wasn't really an end to the violence. Instead, it marked this fundamental, tragic shift in the balance of power throughout New England. It was a turning point that would have consequences for generations. To really wrap your head around this sheer scale of this conflict, let's just look at the numbers. 9,000 people killed. Now, in a region where the total colonial population was only about 80,000, this was an absolutely staggering figure. To put that in perspective, that would be like a war in the United States today, killing nearly 40 million people. But for the indigenous communities, the losses were nothing short of catastrophic. Nearly half of the entire native population in southern New England was wiped out. 5,000 out of 11,000 people. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a demographic collapse that permanently destroyed their military power in the region forever. And look, the cost for the colonists was also immense. 1 in every 10 men of military age in Massachusetts was either killed or captured. Proportionally, that makes King Philip's War one of the deadliest conflicts in all of American history. And the brutality? Wow. It didn't even end with death. After Metacom was killed, his body was quartered. His head was sent to Plymouth and mounted on a pike above the town's watchtower. And it stayed there for more than 2 decades, a constant grim symbol of English dominance. But the war's true legacy isn't just in the battlefield statistics. It's in what happened after the fighting stopped. This is where we uncover the story of how the conflict gave rise to a whole new, systematized form of indigenous slavery in New England. So to make this system work, the colonists used a legal and moral justification. They argued that because they were fighting a just war, they had the right to enslave their captives. This wasn't some hidden crime. It was an open policy. It was a way to turn human beings into revenue under the guise of righteousness. Hundreds of Native people, including Metacom's own wife and son, were sold at auctions and shipped to plantations in the West Indies or even North Africa. And you can see here how the system evolved. It started with prisoners of war. But after the war, when the number of captives started to dwindle, the system adapted. Colonial courts began sentencing Native people for really minor offenses like theft or debt to these long terms of indentured servitude. But these terms were often so long that they became, in effect, a life sentence of slavery. And then it gets written into law. This right here just codifies the complete dehumanization of Native people. To see them legally classified alongside livestock as taxable property, that tells you everything you need to know about how their status had been utterly transformed in the eyes of the colonists. They weren't people anymore, they were property. And this practice didn't just fade away, not at all. It persisted for generations, like a lasting scar from the war. I mean, look at the census data from Rhode Island, taken nearly a century later in 1774, right on the eve of the American Revolution. It shows that over a third of the Native American population was still living inside white households, most of them as indentured servants. This quote from a colonist named Edward Randolph is just a chilling look into the mindset that drove this whole system. He looks back at the 3,000 Native people killed in the war, and he doesn't see a human tragedy. He sees an economic problem, a loss of potential labor that was now making it more expensive to hire help. So this is the question we're really left with, right? When we add this story of a devastating war and the system of slavery it created back into our understanding of early America, it completely challenges that simple, peaceful narrative of pilgrims and Thanksgiving. It forces us to see a much more complex and, frankly, a much more brutal foundation to the country we know today. It's a reminder that history is never as simple as the stories we like to tell ourselves.